gone out with a very recent poll, very comprehensive national poll, as Veronica said, one of the most comprehensive, and it was meant to pull together the various elements behind the court's reasoning, as well as sort of shed some light, some of it pretty intuitive, some very expected, and some a little more interesting, and we'll get into some of that going forward. So what's important to understand the context when Daron presents the poll results is it's not just because we're inherently interested in what people think about this, but that it actually intersects with the court's reasoning about the constitutionality of almost all laws bearing on the regulation of money in politics. So without further ado, let me turn over to Daron and share some of our results.
Sure, I'm going to move over here and occupy this podium and give you a brief walkthrough here. Excellent, we seem to be in good shape. First of all, I'd like to thank Veronica Stuyvesant and her colleagues at the LBJ School for all of their diligent and professional work in putting this conference together. I'd also like to thank all of you for coming out this morning. It's a terrific fall day, maybe the nicest day we've had in, now in 6 months or so. So we appreciate your interest and hope to make this as informative and entertaining a session as we possibly can. I'll preface these remarks by saying when I was growing up in San Diego, I was a big fan of the old detective series Columbo. And one of the things I liked about Columbo, this is different from other detective stories where you had to wait and sort of it would gradually be revealed who done it in the last scene. In Columbo, you got at the very first scene the murder or the crime. You always knew what was going to happen, and the whole process was Columbo putting it together, but the audience already knew what was going on. All right, that's my point of departure for today. I'm going to tell you what I found, and then we can talk a little bit about how it is we got there. All right, so, and I actually had a mentor at UCLA where I went to grad school, and he said, we don't write murder mysteries in political science. And so that's the way I kind of do my papers, and that's what I'd like to do today. So let me mention that we basically broke this poll, conceptualized this poll into 6 different parts. We were interested in the issue of salience. That is, do people care about money in politics? Do they care about corruption inherently? Is it a real problem compared with the economy or jobs or healthcare, some of the other issues that dominate the public conversation? And we found, in fact, that they care about corruption. They don't care too much about campaign finance. The second point, or second major topic, are the particulars of campaign finance itself. Do they like McCain-Feingold? Do they support regulation? Do they support public airtime? And we found that by and large, they're actually fairly open to regulation of campaign finance. But they're much more open to regulation of corporations and interest groups than they are of regulation of individual contributors. So groups, they're fine with. Individuals, less so. The third major area is campaign usefulness. That is, do voters think they get anything out of campaigns? Is the information provided by candidates something that they take to heart when they make their voting decisions? And we found here, and this was actually very surprising, that they're quite positive about the information they get from candidates in campaigns. They're much less positive about other sources of information. A fourth major area was corruption. And here's where we saw perhaps the least surprising results, but it was very nice to get a specific bead on them. Basically, Americans think that the federal government is bought and sold by special interest groups. And there is no hyperbole in that statement, as we'll see when we get to the particulars. Fifth, we were interested in contributions. There was a lot of conversation in 2008 about the amount of small contributors that were getting involved in the system. And so we were interested in asking people, do you contribute to politics? What other forms of participation are you engaged in? But in particular, do you contribute? And if so, how? Because we were interested in getting an up-to-the-moment assessment of online contributions and contributions using more contemporary technologies. And then sixth and finally, we were interested in levels of knowledge. Now, knowledge is an area where there's a lot of public opinion research, most of it fairly negative. People don't seem to know very much about politics. We wanted to do a little bit of that, but we were also interested in the particular area of campaign finance. Do people know anything about the federal system? And we found that they had some interesting guesses, and their guesses tend to be biased upwards, and they tend to be biased in favor of special interests dominating the system. I actually thought they knew a little more than I had assumed, but that's because I had extremely low expectations about what they would know. So that's kind of where we're going. So with that, let's actually look at the particulars here. The study itself, as you can see here, was conducted in mid-October. I think it's important to identify the population, some of the particulars. So let me be quite clear. We were interested in the opinions of adults, adult citizens here. So these are people who self-identified as citizens of the United States, 18 years or older. The poll was in the field for a little over a week, about 10 days in total of surveying. And we ended up getting about 2,100 people. All right, so if you're interested in margins of error, it's about a plus or minus 2 points. So any particular point estimate that we offered could be 2 points higher, 2 points lower. And all data that we got were weighted by the results of the 2006 American Community Study. So in other words, the gender population we had was, I think, 53 female, 47 male. Those data were weighted slightly because the true distribution is 52 female, 48 male. So there were some slight adjustments to make sure we were absolutely representative of the underlying population. All right, first topic was salience. And what you have here is a bar graph representing ratings on a 0 to 10 scale, where 10 represents extremely important, 0 represents not important at all. So as the bars increase in size, that's an indication that people think the issue is important. And in red, I've identified two issues that are particularly relevant for the conversation today: political corruption on the bottom, and then right above that, campaign finance reform. If you just throw these numbers out, for instance, and you saw that the average rating on this 0 to 10 scale was 6.6. You would, I think, reasonably infer that, well, Americans think that campaign finance is a pretty important issue. Scores almost a 7 on a 0 to 10 scale. When you see the ratings that go to other issues, I think it puts it in a little bit of context. For instance, it scores about the same, so it scores lower than the environment, obviously lower than jobs or education or anything like that. It's right about news media bias and stem cell research. Not that these aren't important issues, but clearly this issue is not at the top of most Americans' agenda. Now, corruption, political corruption as a distinct issue, is higher. That's the average rating was 8.4. That's only a tenth of a percentage point lower, or a tenth of a point lower than education. So corruption actually scores pretty high, but campaign finance not so much. By the way, these people were presented these issues randomly. So they were sort of, a particular individual could get any different ordering of these issue items. So some got corruption first, some got campaign finance first. It was something varied independently and randomly across survey respondents. All right. So they think corruption is an issue, but not so much campaign finance. All right, well, given that, what do they actually think about campaign finance? It's our second area of inquiry. And we asked some particular items here. For instance, the bar graph here represents, in red, the percent saying they agree with the particular campaign finance provision. So 24% said they agreed with McCain-Feingold. We didn't offer much of a description of what it was, which is manifest in the fact that 51% said they don't know enough about it to have an opinion. So slightly more agree than disagree, but most people have no idea what McCain-Feingold is. We asked about whether citizen contributions should be unlimited. That is, an individual should be allowed to give as much money as he or she chooses. And as you see, that scores about evenly. 45% say yes, 43% say no. And we asked about a particular provision of the 2002 Campaign Finance Reform Act, BICRA, that institutes a 60-day ban on union and corporate ads funded with soft money. And we found that 56% of people agreed with that, thought that was a terrific idea, right? Which may speak to the fact that it is sick of television advertising, particularly sponsored by special interest groups. So there's some appetite here for regulation. Not overwhelming, but some. We asked about some particular provisions, and these are probably going to be too small for those of you in the back to read, but let me just go over some of the more interesting findings here. The largest support is actually, again, this is on a 0 to 10 scale, asking about whether you agree or disagree, 10 meaning strongly agree, 0 meaning strongly disagree. And the highest score here is 7.2. The average rating is 7.2, so much more agree than disagree, on free and equal airtime as a potential reform to the system. The next highest score was increase the authority and resources for the Federal Election Commission. So in other words, pound the guilty. Jesus. And then you get 6.2 for replace the FEC with an independent regulatory body. As most of you know, the Federal Election Commission is ruled by a bipartisan, three Democrats, 3 Republican person panel. So there seems to be some appetite for better regulation of the current system. The one outlier here, you'll notice, 2.1, so very, very little support, for a provision that says allow unions to make political expenditures without member consent, which is a particular issue that's kind of being debated in Washington right now. But what I guess maybe the bottom line here is if 5 is kind of the demarcation point, 5 and up represents support for a campaign finance regulation, there's support for almost all of these measures, with the exception of the union provision. Even 5.1, unlimited individual contributions with disclosure. Right, so any number of these score reasonably well. I put this here just so you can kind of see the way that we ask questions, but I'm not so interested in that as giving the results. We were interested, okay, it's easy to say you're for regulation, but regulation, as Professor Roberts points out, often involves some kind of limitation of free speech. Right? You know, the more you regulate it, potentially the more free speech you're giving up. And so we decided to break down this trade-off into 2 broad components, because one area in which you're asked to give up free speech is to equalize influence. Right? That's a justification for regulation. And another justification is to limit corruption. And so we want an explicit trade-off question here. To what extent are you willing to limit some free speech rights in order to, right here, equalize influence, or down here, to limit corruption? And as you see, this is a 0 to 10 rating scale, where 10 means I'm willing to surrender some free speech rights in order to accomplish the broader goal. What you see is the averages here on a 10-point scale are 3.2 for equalizing influence and 3.7 for limiting corruption. So while people generally are in favor of campaign finance regulation, when it comes to their specific free speech rights, there's a great reticence here, even to achieve some broader goal. And again, that's the distinction between my individual rights versus sort of corporates or unions or groups or special interests. Okay, this is a big, long one again. My point here is, I don't want you to read this necessarily, but this is how we asked the Citizens United case, the one that's pending before the Supreme Court, which essentially could constitute a complete overturn of the campaign finance system. And we figured that people don't know anything about the Citizens United case, so we were going to give them as much information and as balanced a portrayal of information as we possibly could, figure out what they really thought about this case. So all this lead up is our preface here, to give people the Citizens United case and then ask them about the underlying case or the underlying claim in Citizens United, whether groups deserve the same sorts of free speech protections as individuals. And what we found here at the bottom, the tagline here is, having heard all of this, do you think corporations or unions have free speech rights such that government regulation should face a high level of scrutiny? Or do you think that corporations and unions do not merit the same sort of protection as individuals? And what we found is that plurality support that groups do not deserve the same kinds of protections as individuals. You notice a good chunk, 1/3, still say they're not sure. When you give them all this information, you know, it muddies the water a little bit. All right, so, which we also thought was interesting. All right, moving on to the usefulness of campaign information. As I mentioned earlier, Professor Roberts and I were struck by this, and I'm interested in Matt Stiles' reaction here. This is, again, asking people to rate the usefulness of sources of information in the context of a campaign. And what we found, and so we're asking about the candidate's campaign, the opponents, 527s who are in favor, 527s who are opposed to the candidate, local news, national news, and cable news. The most credible or useful source of information is the candidate's campaign itself. The second most credible, which I find very interesting, is cable news. Right? And I'm sure that Walter Cronkite is rolling over in his grave at this point. But at any rate, something that we did not expect to find. So there is some evidence here that specific information from the candidate's campaign is deemed as fairly credible, particularly compared to these other sources. All right. Again, usefulness of campaigns. We were interested in 2 particular items, or one particular item. The question here is, how much attention do you pay to messages at the end of those political ads that disclose who paid for the ad? And so the red on the pie chart here indicates people who said they get some use out of that. The darker red indicates they pay a great deal of attention to that. The lighter red says they pay some attention. So this area right in here represents people who say that means something to them. They get something out of that. So that disclosure apparently is meaningful. The second question over here, the second pie chart, is, does who pay for the ad greatly, somewhat, slightly, or not at all affect the credibility of the ad? And again, the red indicates people saying that it does mean something to them, who paid for that ad. Right, so we actually ran an experiment, which I can touch on in the discussion section, where we varied the source of funding to a generic candidate. And we used various sources and randomly assigned what people saw, whether their candidates was sponsored by the tobacco industry, the trial lawyers, or by friends and acquaintances. And we looked at people's reaction to the candidate based on where they got money. At the same time, we varied how much money they got from those different sources. And the bottom line was, we found that people care about where the money comes from. They're not so interested in how much money is raised. So any money from a non-credible source or from a disreputable source is bad money, at least in the minds of voters. Okay, this is actually backed up by just simple questions we asked directly of people. We asked people, how much of a factor is the following to your decision to purchase a product or to vote for a candidate? Companies' political beliefs. This is Austin, so this should be of no surprise to anybody. 55% said that it makes a difference. Makes a difference. That company's political beliefs matters. When it comes to the source of a candidate's contribution, 58% say that matters, where that candidate's getting their money from. And again, apropos of our experiment, only 29% said the amount of money a candidate raises matters to them. So again, it's where you get the money, not how much. Moving on to corruption, I just put a series of items in which we found Americans very, very consistent and adamant in their beliefs that our politicians are corrupt. How often do politicians in Washington base their vote on the preferences of campaign contributors? 68%, often or sometimes. How often do politicians demand contributions from wealthy contributors? 58%, all the time or often. And on and on. Last one, compared to 10 years ago, has corruption increased, decreased, or stayed the same? 61% say it has increased over the last decade. Serious problem, 82% said that corruption in the US Congress is a very serious or somewhat serious problem. So getting back to Professor Roberts' point about appearance of corruption, it's rampant in this poll. All right. Now we asked, again, just to bear this point out, please tell me how much power you think each of these groups has in influencing government policymakers and politicians in Washington. Again, these were randomly presented to people. But notice the top. On a 0 to 10 scale of influence, the average voter is 2.8. Lagging only slightly, big companies at 8.2. PACs at 8. Political lobbyists, 8.2. The wealthy, 8. So the four entities scoring 8 or above are all corporations, wealthy interests, et cetera. So clearly there's a perception the system is skewed dramatically towards those at the high end. Now, moving to participation real briefly, we actually find a surprising amount of people who say that they have participated in politics over the last 4 years. And 62% at this sort of low end of participation levels said they've discussed politics. 60% said they voted in a primary. And when you get to contributions, so that's our bottom bar here, 1/4 of Americans, 25%, said they have contributed to a political campaign in the last 4 years. So 1 out of 4. Of that 25%, 69% say they contributed online. So almost 70% of contributors say they have contributed online, compared to mail, phone, and at a donor event, which lag behind fairly considerably. Again, this is self-reported, but it is what it is. Moving on to knowledge, our last topic. How much do they actually know about the nuts and bolts of the federal election system? We have a couple of examples. We actually asked a whole range of questions, but I put 2 graphs up here. The one on the left here, how much can the person contribute to candidates who run for federal office in a single election cycle? What's the correct answer, by the way? How much?
2,400 for primary and 2,400 for...
Right. And it was, it's part of the BICR reforms, and it's indexed for inflation. So yeah, it's about, in the last cycle it was like a little over 20. Yeah.
It's 24 now.
Yeah, so it's 24 now. So what you have is a chart representing the average response. We asked an open-ended question, said, you tell us. And what you see actually, not too bad. There's a spike here between 2,000 and 2,400. It's actually the modal response. But I guess the negative way is that only about 23 or 24% of Americans were there. Most Americans, as you see this skew here, those answering between 10,000 and 100,000 plus, you add them up, it's about 14% of the population. So quite a few people, and there's an obvious skew towards the high end here as these numbers get up. On the other side here on the right, what would be your best guess for the percentage of funding for presidential elections that generally comes from special interest groups? And by the way, in this last cycle, it was pretty low. But what you see here is that there's a spike up at 50%, and then there's a skew between 70 and 80, and some people think that 100% of the money in presidential elections comes from special interest groups. Now, the point here is not to say the American public is stupid. I mean, Professor Roberts and I had to look up some of these answers, but we wanted to get a sense of what their thoughts are, right? Because these are obviously going to inform their general perceptions of politics. Final one, what do you think is the average corporate PAC contribution of a U.S. House of Representatives campaign? And as you see, there are some people who say it's less than 1,000, but there's a very strong skew. You get to 10,000, 20, and then a good chunk of people saying 100,000 plus to 1 million. Right? So at any rate, there doesn't seem to be much mastery of the particulars of the federal election system in the United States. Now, just to kind of sum up, first 3 points. On salience, campaign finance reform is not a top issue. It's not like jobs or the economy, but corruption is something that people think is a big deal. Big deal. Campaign finance reform, people are very interested in reform, strong support for limiting corporate and union involvement, and for what we found was they like short, publicly financed campaigns. They really like that. However, Americans also express strong support for these individual level free speech rights. So there are obviously contradictory kind of impulses here animating public opinion. Usefulness, Americans think candidates actually provide useful information in the context of campaigns about themselves. They don't trust what you say about the other guy, but they do trust what you say about yourself. They also claim that they care very much about the source of campaign contributions, and maybe more importantly, they say they act accordingly. If you get money from a dirty source, it's going to limit the willingness of people to support you. The last 3 topics, corruption. This one's simple. Americans believe the federal government is corrupt and is beholden to special interests and contributors. Participation. Again, about 1/4 of Americans say they've contributed to a political campaign in the last 4 years. And again, I point this out because I thought it was fascinating. 70% of contributions or contributors have come online. And then finally, on the knowledge front, Americans really don't know very much about contributions or campaign finance laws. And perhaps more to the point, they assume much more money and much more corporate money is involved than actually is. And so that's our bottom line, hopefully a point of departure and discussion for the panel and for you all. All right, and let me blank this out. I kind of like my American flag, but I'll blank that out so it's not distracting to those of you. So thank you very much.